Zelensky got his kind of fingers burnt when he went to the White House with this. And as much as you could reasonably preempt that Trump and Vance would have behaved like that in that meeting, I think the Zelensky team, or the administration, made an error in that they didn't. I think that he walked into a trap there. And so they will be highly mindful of that. Now, Vladimir Putin is a very different type of politician, a very shrewd, very intelligent politician, but he's not going to engage with Zelensky in that way. I think that there's much greater seriousness to this, and he's more likely to be more courteous, I think, to him. You got to remember that Putin and Zelensky have met each other before, so it's not like, I mean, they're not mates, right? But they're both first language is Russian, and so the negotiations will occur in Russian. But also they're probably culturally closer to each other as well. So I think that it will be a very different type of meeting, but that doesn't mean that Zelensky won't go in with the sort of painful memory of that moment at the White House in the back of his mind. There's a Xi Jinping staring off into the distance handshake, and then there's an actual handshake, and the non-verbal communication analyst in me can say that how these two men will behave in the handshake carries a lot of weight in it. So if you look at something like the Trump and Kim Jong-un meetings during the first Trump presidency, you can see the strength of feeling within this. And also, as I say, there's an acting in it as well. They are performing for the cameras here. And, Xi Jinping's a brilliant example of this, where he's just seems like he just has so much disinterest in what he's doing. And Putin plays that same kind of card at times as well. I think Zelensky is most likely, if we're talking handshake, Zelensky is most likely to be the most kind of honest with his handshake. That row that we saw in the White House, from a communications analyst point of view, seemed to be, pretty legit, right? It didn't seem like it was. I think Trump and Vance, sorted themselves out first. It didn't just happen on the fly for them, but it happened. Zelensky was working on his feet in that moment. However, I think we should celebrate that conflict, because we live in an age of such mediated politics where everything is about performance, or everything gets filtered through the vacuum of how will this look for the public. And so we kind of cling to these moments of authenticity. And rather than getting annoyed about it, actually celebrate it and say that was a little bit of genuine politics, which we so rarely see. We actually deceive ourselves a lot of the time, where what we think is genuine. So, for example, PMQs on a Wednesday is all choreographed, right? It's not really real. And we think it's real. We think that's real politics. We think that's real debate, and it's not. Okay, that was, and I would say we should have more of that. That might be a kind of an unpopular opinion for some people. It might make people more anxious because people were watching that and were tense while they watched it. But ultimately, my argument would be that we have to value the truth more than anything else. And there is a significant truth vacuum that we live in for the last 20 years or so, particularly in the age of social media. So I think it was a good thing. And if Zelensky and Putin had a similar kind of ding-dong back and forth with each other, which led to an element of animosity. Well, yes, it may well have negative outcomes for for example, the people of Eastern Ukraine. You know, there might be an intensification of there, but at least we would see more clearly as a public the route forward here. Both people would have said things that were honest, and I think various people, but Churchill said that, in warfare, the first casualty is the truth. And I think that if we actually see something which is a genuine, authentic discussion, unplanned, unchoreographed, then, grasp it and, phone me up again and let's have another chat about it, right? And also in diplomacy, particularly wartime diplomacy, you have to understand that yes, you are meeting people who have most likely done you harm. And we saw this in any peace negotiation. We saw this during the sort of former Yugoslav conflicts. We've seen it closer to home. We've seen it in Northern Ireland with the Good Friday agreements. We saw it in Colombia a few years ago when they tried to end the civil war. And as I say, with that responsibility to try to bring at least a reduction in these dreadful circumstances, comes an understanding that you have to engage with people who you firmly disagree with and may well find to be quite repugnant. I mean, we saw last week when Mark Carney met Donald Trump, there's been various sort of memes going around the internet of how Carney was kind of looking at Trump, essentially saying like he was quite pained to be kind of in this room trying to talk to this person, but talk he must, and that's his role. So, as I say, Zelensky hopefully treats it with the maturity and the responsibility that it deserves. He's maintained his kind of pseudo-military wear throughout the conflict, which again is symbolic that he is the wartime president. So if you see photos of Zelensky when he first met Putin in 2019, he's wearing a suit. But he's an actor, right? So I think I've written an article about this before, but his sense of choreography is strong, and he's pretty good at the choreography aspect of politics, which in this highly mediated 21st century is kind of half the battle, or maybe even more than half the battle. So I think Zelensky's decision to wear a suit or not, or to maintain the kind of regular semi-combat fatigues that he wears, in propaganda studies, the likelihood of Zelensky wearing a suit would distract from the content of what was said, because you guys would talk about it. And if Zelensky actually wants or believes that the meeting can have substantive benefit on policy grounds and on perhaps even joint communiques and being a route forward towards a positive outcome for Ukraine, then I'd say he's likely to maintain his dress code of the war. If this doesn't have much content to it, then I think we might see various distraction techniques going on from all leaders. Maybe a bit more sort of flamboyance from Trump, etc., in these sorts of circumstances. But it's a good question. It's one thing that you and your readers can ponder on, or can perhaps, if a meeting happens, can be kind of keen observers of. But politics is all about power. And you can debate the concept of power, whether in terms of that kind of real power, like military power, economic power, or kind of relational aspects of power. But the reality is that politicians, particularly those who hold power, meet other politicians who also hold power. And Zelensky is the president of Ukraine and therefore holds power. And so that is justification enough to meet somebody. So to say, I'm not going to meet you, in terms of the image of that, would be seen as petulant. And I mean this in terms of Putin. Putin is highly reliant upon his domestic image within Russia. And as much as the international press and observers create a very different image of Putin, you know, Russian history tells us that quite often leaders who were perceived well in the West were perceived poorly in Russia. So somebody like Mikhail Gorbachev is an absolutely prime example of this from the 80s, who's seen as a very weak leader in Russia, but was a kind of darling of the West. And you can even go back to people like Catherine the Great, and you can sort of debate their legacies as well. So it's I think that whilst the negotiators will work out how the talks will happen, if and how the talks will happen, and that will go back and forth for days or even weeks to try and make sure that there is an agreement on that in terms of the choreography, the strategizing of it. I think it would be pretty foolhardy of Vladimir Putin to say, I'm not going to meet Zelensky. Zelensky is a powerful actor and therefore is deserving of company, if you like.